Welcome. I'm Doug Morgan, and you're listening to Uncommon Sense, where we hunt for the truth in the topics you're not supposed to talk about, Christianity and politics. My dad once told me that I should get a government job because it was a career that you couldn't get fired from, basically, and had great benefits. I was not interested in a career in government, though, beyond elected positions. But he was not wrong, really, about his assessment. Luke Rosiak from the Daily Wire writes this. He says, if government bureaucrats seem a little slower than employees elsewhere, well, it could be because a court-ordered order prohibits the federal government from using tests to objectively rank job applicants on the basis that hiring the most competent employees had an adverse impact on blacks and Hispanics. Yeah, yeah, racism. A 1981 court order blocked agencies from using any test for job applicants that would result in a statistically significant difference in hiring rates between blacks and Hispanics on one hand and whites on the other hand. That is akin to blocking colleges from using the SAT. Now, the Trump administration is set to ask a Washington, D.C. court to dissolve the 40-year ban, arguing that it illegally puts race over merit when it comes to federal hiring. The move seems likely to prevail given the Supreme Court's ban on affirmative action and could allow Donald Trump to permanently reshape the permanent federal workforce into one comprised of the best and the brightest, which is, of course, what we want, right? You want the best and the brightest working in those positions. Well, the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, it must be relieved of the Luvano Consent Decree. That's what they call it, the Luvano Consent Decree, to return common sense to federal hiring. That's what the Trump administration will tell the D.C. federal court, according to a motion exclusively obtained by the Daily Wire. The motion says that the decree blatantly conflicts with current law because it, quote, requires the federal government to make hiring decisions using explicit racial classification. And this kind of blatant racial favoritism is not permitted under the current Supreme Court precedent. Now, it cites a string of cases, including the 2023 Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard case that ended affirmative action. Quote, by favoring the applications of blacks and Hispanics, the decree disfavors all other racial groups. Like school admissions, hiring in the federal government is a zero-sum proposition, it says. Now, the administration will argue that the decree blocks the president from using heavily researched and predictive tests that would streamline the federal hiring process and lead to a more capable workforce. In the 1970s, OPM evaluated hiring prospects via a written test called the Professional Administrative Career Examination, or they shorten it to PACE. It scores accurately predicted who would go on to be exemplary employees, but a class action lawsuit said that testing for cognitive ability would reduce the number of blacks and Hispanics in the workforce. I mean, that in itself is racist, right? Well, if we see who is the most competent to fill the position, well, we're not going to get very many blacks and Hispanics, so we're going to sue. Well, President Jimmy Carter, of course, his administration maintained that PACE was rigorously developed to be fair and was accurate and useful. But in the final days of Carter's term, the administration agreed to a legal settlement with the plaintiffs agreeing to stop using the test and give them veto power over any replacement. In the next decade, OPM developed 6 different tests to attempt to satisfy the decree. But every test that accurately identified the most competent workers also had the greatest adverse impact to blacks. And this is what the court was told years ago. Even though nothing in the tests was, on its face, racist. So in 1990, OPM tried another test, which combined objective questions that measured cognitive ability with a, as they put it, self-rating section that helps reduce adverse impact. That still wasn't enough to create the exact statistical equity demanded by the ruling. And as a result, OPM began using solely the self-rating section. In other words, the only test OPM has found to result in a large portion of blacks in the workforce is the one that essentially measures boastfulness. Yeah, boastfulness. That's what I said. Many federal agencies now hire based on a multiple choice questionnaire where applicants rank themselves based on how great they are at different tasks. This has become a common method of ranking applicants to federal jobs, even though the Merit System Protection Board found that it is this is how they put it, far less able to predict future performance. So even though you can't predict whether or not this person is going to be a good employee or not, you at least know how prideful they are. Quote, by relying solely on self-assessments of life and work experience and training, the rating schedule struggles to distinguish between entry-level candidates, none of whom have a great deal of experience. The Trump administration motion says that as a result, many agencies have expressed dissatisfaction with the quality of candidates referred by OPM from this rating schedule. The Carter-era settlement also gave a boost to those with oral Spanish language proficiency and or the requisite knowledge of Hispanic culture, while not even mentioning any racial groups except blacks and Hispanics. The Trump administration will argue that such institutional reform decrees were never intended to turn the federal court into an indefinite institutional monitor. It said that the government can only use race in certain narrowly tailored situations that must be flexible, have a sunset provision, and be of limited duration, as it says. It said that when the Supreme Court struck down Harvard's affirmative action program, it pointed out that affirmative action was supposed to have been temporary. The Lugano consent decree said jurisdiction shall expire 5 years, get this, 5 years after the cessation of the use of PACE results. Yet the motion says that was more than 40 years ago, and there is still no end in sight. Even if it were permissible to make hiring decisions to achieve racial outcomes, none of its plans have worked as intended. And this is what the motion said. OPM also added a fast track to hiring for employees who had a high GPA or ranked near the top of their class, intended to attract people from historically black colleges. Yet white women came to be the primary group hired through the Outstanding Scholarship Program, as they called it. Now, the Daily Wire's analysis of the OPM data showed that blacks are overrepresented, yes, overrepresented in the federal workforce, not underrepresented, making it hard to justify the continuance of course, the affirmative action decree. 18% of cabinet agency employees are black, 18. And about 50, that's about 50% higher than the percentage of blacks in the population of the United States. At at some agencies, the disproportionality is astounding, such as 36% of the Department of Education and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. 36. And 29% at the Department of Treasury. Again, I remind you, about 9% of U.S. citizenry is black. Now, the 1981 consent decree relies on the disproportionate impact theory, which holds that anytime an outcome doesn't exactly mirror the races of the overall population, it is enough to prove racism, even if no tangible racism occurred. That has been rejected even by even many Democrats, but it still continues. That's the equity part, right? It's not equitable. We're not talking about equality. We're talking about equitable. And so they say if the numbers don't show, like 9% of the population of the federal government should be black, then it's not equitable if it's not there. Well, of course, now we're seeing things like 36% in some departments. You see, many on the left have been reduced to arguing that diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI measures, don't pit racial identities against competence, something that is plainly untrue when it comes to OPM using the competency tests. Colleges that flirted with going SAT free around 2021-ish or so, we talked about that on the podcast. Well, they have largely reversed their decisions. They obviously saw that as being something that they could not continue doing. Now, Senator Chuck Schumer, he's the wacko from New York, the Democrat there, has told New York City Democrats to stop trying to do away with the entrance exam to a math magnet high school just because mostly Asians do well on it. And President Joe Biden signed a law getting rid of a similar life experience survey used to boost minority hiring for air traffic controllers after outrage about it could put lives at risk. Well, the motion will be argued by the Office of U.S. Attorney for D.C., Ed Martin. He's kind of a hard-charging conservative who has sought to undo liberals' use of the D.C. court system for political purposes, including dismissing January 6 cases after Trump pardoned them. He has also indicted an alleged Chinese spy, investigated a Kamala Harris staffer for alleged fraud, and vowed to imprison thugs with guns, as he puts it. The motion set to be filed soon by the Trump administration says that by favoring the applications of blacks and Hispanics, the decree disfavors all other racial groups, like school admissions, hiring in the federal government. It is a zero-sum proposition. So what we are finding out here is what many of us already knew. Many government workers live in a completely different world than the private sector workers. And to kind of demonstrate that, I saw this article from Allison Green, and she writes for Slate, of course, which is a very, very liberal publication. But I wanted to bring this to you because I think it really shows what I'm talking about here. This is a good example, and this article is entitled "We're All Fired." But she says the federal workers who have been fired or laid off by the Trump administration, now numbering in excess of 200,000, one question is on most of their minds: what now? For those who've built their careers working for the federal government, the prospect of looking for a job, she says, outside of it can be daunting. And the system for finding and applying for federal jobs is different from the one for private employment. And feds who aren't used to it will need to learn an entirely new method of job hunting. Wow, imagine that. For example, she says, resumes for federal jobs are sometimes long, often 10 pages or more. They tend to include detailed information that would be considered wildly excessive for most private sector jobs, which typically expect concise resumes for only a page or two. Okay, so I mean, so far so good, right? I mean, they don't have to fill out a 10-page resume now if they want to try to get a job in the private sector. So far so good. Um, yeah, she says, for those who've um, built their careers here, they need to completely do something entirely different when it comes to the private sector. She said private jobs are posted on completely different places. Even federal jobs are all advertised on usajobs.gov, while identifying open positions outside the government can mean consulting a variety of niche job boards. And finding work through those job boards can be rough for anyone. Jobs posted there often get so inundated with applicants that many candidates don't expect to hear back and are pleasantly surprised when they do. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a second. So, so we're supposed to feel bad here for the federal workers here because instead of going to one website, they have to go to many, and some of these private sector job, people hiring for them might not even call them back. Wow. I think I've experienced that with the federal government before, where I tried to, get some answers from them, and I didn't even get a call back. Some jobs, she says, posted there don't even exist, meaning candidates are sending their application materials into the void. Into the void. That sounds ominous. Federal workers who are likely used to jobs that are actually real might find this transition particularly rocky, especially now that the private sector is being flooded with ex-feds. Yeah, I mean, it can be tough to get a job, right? Government interviews also tend to be much more rigid and structured than those in the private sector. True. I'd agree with her on that. Interviewers are often restricted to asking every applicant the exact same questions with their answers ranked on a numerical scale. She says it's a system implemented to prevent cronyism. But anyway, she said, and mandatory weighting also of factors like military service and prior agency experience. Interviews outside the government can be much more freewheeling in a way that may feel like culture shock for anyone who's spent most of their career in the public service and is used to jobs being awarded based on objective qualifications and not, say, personality. Okay, so again, let's stop here for a second. Okay, if the federal government has been hiring, as it has, as we know now, has been hiring basically to try to not hire white applicants and Asian applicants and the like, but just to simply hire blacks and Hispanics. I mean, this is what it's been happening. Obviously, we see this now. Then this freewheeling interview experience is a shock to them, and 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 obviously, why is it this way? Why is it so freewheeling? Well, if I have a company and I'm hiring somebody, I want to know who is the best for the job. And sometimes it's not asking the exact same questions over and over again that they know is coming. Maybe it's to make them think and see how they can do on their feet. I mean, how they can think on their feet and how they might come to a conclusion that they haven't already arranged to say. So yes, I am trying to find, if I'm hiring this way, I'm trying to find who's the most competent, not necessarily who has the right skin color. But let's go on. It says, but before former feds even get to the interview stage, they'll need to figure out how to demonstrate that the skills they built in government jobs will transfer to jobs outside of it. Oh, so some of the things they've been doing are really matching up to, jobs that really mean something, is what she's saying. In some cases, she says, this will be easy, such as data analysis. Data analysis who is applying for another data analysis job. But in others, it will take more work. As a former national parks worker who was just fired told AP, if you're doing, say, vegetation sampling and prescribed fire as your main work, there aren't many jobs. All the work people put into their careers in the park workers' case, the master's degree, the urban forestry classes, the wildlife deployments can suddenly seem overwhelmingly useless. Okay. So maybe they wouldn't be quite as useless in this case, this example of firework, if the government hadn't shut down a lot of the forestry jobs with the spotted owl and things, right? Maybe there would be more forestry work for them to go to. She goes on and she says, so it might not be clear what sort of jobs someone who worked in, say, disaster relief or anti corruption should even target. Again, some skills will be transferable. Someone who worked in anti corruption might look at corporate social responsibility jobs or fraud prevention, while someone with disaster relief could look at logistics and emergency response for private companies. But it will take some work to find out where to apply those skills and how to translate them to the private sector employees. Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it might take some work here. But is that bad? I mean, seriously, um, this reminds me of the responses we got out of Obama and out of Biden. Okay, when Obama shut down much of the coal industry, what did he and his Secretary of State, um, Hillary Clinton, what did they say to those people? Well, you better probably learn how to code. And what did Biden say when he, shut down, part of the oil industry? Well, you probably better learn how to code. Well, is this any different? Maybe you find a different career. Maybe you find something that works, that brings in money for your family. That isn't just money handed out from the government for doing weird stuff out in the woods somewhere or something. Well, she goes on, she says, this can be hard to do without firsthand experience with the types of jobs they're targeting. As one job researcher, Fed, wrote to me, quote, I have been a government employee virtually my entire adult life. I loved what I did and felt like I was making an important difference. Now my job is disappearing. I feel empty and lost. The work I did doesn't have a parallel in the private sector. I listen to friends and family talk about corporate life and feel like I'm learning about a culture on a different planet. I have no idea how to even start making that transition. Well, here's someone who, relied on the government to provide for her career for a lifetime. And that's just not reality. Again, she was living on another planet, and now she's having to face reality that, you know what? Sometimes jobs come to an end, and it may be even a job that you like. It may be a job that you felt fulfilled in, but you know what? It ended, and that's life. It happens. Well, she goes on, she says, one tip for people struggling with this: look at industries that are heavily regulated and subject to significant government oversight, which can include anything from pharma to agricultural to finance. Here, experience from the regulator side can provide an advantage. Okay, I mean I'll go with that. That's a good tip. And if former feds are lucky enough to find new employment, they'll need to assimilate to jobs that come with a very different set of benefits and disadvantages. Many federal workers took their jobs, at least in part, because of the purported stability of government work. Okay. They accepted lower salaries than they could earn in the private sector in exchange for what has always been considered the fairly secure nature of federal employment. Now, I'm not going to go with her on that. I think a lot of these federal jobs they were making more than they could in the private sector. But even if there are some, I mean, again, that's fine because they're making it up and then some with the benefits. She says this is a particularly bitter twist given what's happening now. Quote, I took a $15,000 pay cut for this opportunity and picked up and left the community, family, and friends who I grew up with to move to DC for this job. This is what one fired National Institute of Health worker told me, she says. Quote, this work what is important, and at a time when trust is some of these in some of these institutions was low, I wanted to contribute to rebuilding that trust. Now I find myself without a job, and honestly, I feel stranded in this city. Everyone in DC is smart and has a good resume, so the market is especially competitive, making this all the more anxiety inducing. The fact that I sacrifice so much feels horrible. Uh, Again, I mean, this is life, right? This happens. And again, I'm not saying that, I'm not poo-pooing all of this, but what I am saying is this is reality. Welcome to it. Yes, I mean, if you are a federal worker and who's lost their job or whatever, I pray for you. I'm sorry that you did, but at the same time, you know what? This is what needs to happen, and it is reality. And so many federal workers, so many government workers, period, are just living on a completely different planet. She says another particularly unjust challenge that some workers now have to contend with is that they were fired during their probationary periods, and she's saying that, well, who's going to hire somebody who just got fired? Well, I don't know how much of that is really what they're looking at here, but she also says facing a different type of uncertainty are the people who lost their jobs because of their work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, who now wonder whether they need to leave that work off their resumes altogether in this new climate. The answer depends on circumstances, she says. Candidates should assume DEI experience is a no-go across the board. All resume content should be tailored toward what will make you the strongest candidate for the particular job you're applying for and for the particular employer you're applying with. Okay, again, let's stop here for a second. That again is reality. Isn't that what you do? You're supposed to, when you put together a resume, you're supposed to know who you're talking to, just like a speaker would. You got to know who your audience is, and you're going to put on that resume things that you think they're going to like, and you're going to leave off things that you think they're not going to like, and you're going to try to make yourself out to be the best candidate possible on that resume. That is what's happening here. Instead of relying on the fact that my skin color gets me into a federal job or something, maybe showing that you have experience, maybe showing that you have a skill set that is competent to the position that you're applying for is a good thing. She goes on and says, in some cases, that will point toward leaving out DEI work, but in others, you could and should leave it on. You might also look at some of the ways companies are renaming this work, depending on the specifics of what you work on. You might reword it as community engagement, inclusive product development, organizational culture, or employee well-being. Moreover, if DEI issues are important to you, you might decide to leave it on your resume to serve as a screening device for you to screen out employers who take issue with it. Not everyone has the luxury of doing that, but if you do, it's worth considering. See, she concludes this with, and of course, fired feds are stuck navigating all of this while shell-shocked by having their careers pulled out from underneath them, often careers built over decades of public service and sacrifice. Job searching can be rough under the best of circumstances. It's astonishingly hard under these. So, again, if you if you follow into this category where you have just been laid off or fired or whatever, I am not making fun of you. I am not saying that every single person feels this way. Every single person feels entitled to this job. I know of a number of government workers that do a great job, that I've experienced some great customer service with, or whatever. But as someone just told me just the other day, they there was he was commenting on a bunch of Forestry Service employees that had been let go. And he said he was going to have to now pick up the slack in doing some of what they would normally do. But he said, he goes, I don't necessarily feel really bad about this, or for them. He said, because he goes, I have seen them just sit around in cabins for 6 to 8 hours straight, just talking and not doing anything. And unfortunately, in the governmental system, what we have is many times we have positions that just have no accountability. And now what's happening is that is starting to come to an end, and we're seeing people being that maybe aren't absolutely necessary. They're being let go, and the belt tightening is happening even within the government, where it hasn't really happened for a very long time, and now people are reacting to that. And I would love to hear from you on it. Maybe it's affecting you, maybe it's not, but I would love to hear from you on it. Of course, you can always do that at uncommonsensepodcast.com. We're also on YouTube now. Would love to hear from you, and thank you for listening. This podcast is a production of Morganite Communications.